The international rule of law suffered the greatest shock for 2 decades in the renewed Russian aggression against Ukraine that began on the 24th of February last year. The invasion was a most serious violation of the prohibition on interstate use of force, the cornerstone of contemporary jus ad bellum. It has been followed by a catalogue of grave violations of international humanitarian law and gross violations of human rights by Russia's forces. That this war of aggression was perpetrated by a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, the body which is given primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, is an added blow to international legality. Not since the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003 have we seen such an egregious breach of a peremptory norm of international law. Despite the overt nature of the military action, there are some who would seek to excuse the aggression initiated by President Putin. A few would even cast Russia as the victim, not the perpetrator, somehow compelled into invading its neighbor and further violating its territorial integrity. To concede this would be a grave error in both fact and law. Ukraine is an independent nation entitled to choose its own destiny. That it rejects vassal status is a reflection of its state sovereignty. Any comparisons with Quebec and Canada are thus specious. When one considers the conduct of the invasion and partial occupation of Ukrainian territory by Russian military and paramilitary forces, the reluctance to yield to the diktat of the aggressor is all the more comprehensible. Ukrainian forces appear to have committed a number of serious violations of international humanitarian law, each and every one of which must be fully investigated and all criminal breaches prosecuted. But their magnitude is overshadowed by the litany of grave breaches of international humanitarian law at the hands of Russian forces. Torture and summary executions of those in the power of an adversary during armed conflict are never permissible, never justifiable. They are war crimes whose perpetrators must be brought to justice. Their commission by members of the invading force has been widespread. To date, however, it appears that not a single Russian soldier has been sanctioned by its own command for any of the egregious acts wrought on the civilians in territory they occupy. Many other violations appear to have been committed during what IHL terms the conduct of hostilities, the fighting in the vernacular. Here, though, a little more caution is needed. IHL is generally far more permissive in the limitations and restrictions it opposes on the use of force during armed conflict than is the international law of law enforcement. Civilian deaths are not, in themselves, hard evidence of an IHL violation. The practical interpretation of the principles of distinction and proportionality, as opposed to their legal application, can be, and often is, problematic. Careful investigation and analysis are therefore needed to confirm or discredit an alleged IHL violation that occurs in the course of combat, whether that be during a ground offensive using small arms or light weapons, or through aerial bombing or long-range artillery. Regrettably, to date, and at the least in certain cases, the quality of analysis of commentators and international observers has not always been fully consistent with the law, nor has the lack of precision in that law been openly acknowledged. A number of Russian soldiers have already been convicted of war crimes by Ukrainian courts. In one early instance, the sentence of life imprisonment initially imposed at trial was reduced to a 15-year term on appeal. But to avoid the taint of lack of justice, all fair trial standards must be rigidly adhered to, and this in every case. Ukrainians who have committed crimes must similarly be held to account before their courts in exactly the same manner. Some senior Russian commanders could ultimately be prosecuted before the International Criminal Court for war crimes and/or crimes against humanity. But this is far more likely in theory than it is in practice. The proposed separate tribunal for trying the authors of aggression in the upper echelons of the Russian military and political hierarchy may not see the light of day. But if it ever does, trials in absentia would be entirely unacceptable. And given the massive loss of life on both sides, but especially among Russian forces, the prospect of some future judicial process is unlikely materially to affect their conduct and their compliance with international humanitarian law. Given the number of apparent violations and the number of violators, traditional justice elements may be more likely to contribute positively to a broader effort to repair the damage that has been done. The media are wont to talk of winners and losers in any armed conflict, but in this, as in well-nigh every war, there are no winners, only losers. The rebuilding of Ukraine, once the conflict is over, will take a generation and come at huge cost. Reparations for fundamental breaches of international law are certainly due, but are unlikely ever to be made or paid. Preparing for the peace will take vision and courage, and painful sacrifices and difficult compromises on all sides are inevitable. Sadly, the end of the conflict is not even in sight. For the Ukrainian soldiers and civilians and the Russian soldiers engaged in the morass, their appalling suffering will continue. Thank you.
And my question will be for Professor Stuart. So I feel like many countries that are far away from Ukraine and Russia don't think that this war will affect them. But of course it will. We are talking about tons of human lives being killed in tragedy ways every single day. So speaking on the role of the young people, how can we fight for justice during this wartime without reaching violence? And what and how we can raise our voices so we can be heard by the politicians and worldwide to help Ukraine and Russia during this, all the victims during this wartime?
My suggestion would be what I tell all my students: seek the truth. You've all heard the old cliche about truth is the first casualty in war. This is no different in the context of Ukraine. And in seeking that truth, I would recommend what we call the ABC of criminal investigation. Assume nothing, believe nobody, check everything. Those are the only ways. And we heard from the professors earlier on, in particular online, there are a lot of beguiling reports on all sides. So go the extra step to try and, as far as is reasonably possible, to understand the truth of what is going on.
Stuart, you haven't spoken as much as anybody else. You want one last comment?
Sure. So I'm going to do a sentence with 4 ifs in it, which shows how unlikely it is. If the West stays the course, if the Ukrainians mount successful offensives in the spring and the summer, if Russian losses continue to mount, and if the prisons are emptied so the Wagner group cannot recruit anymore, then the only way forward will be more conscription. And there may come a point at which the Russian population say, enough. There may. Beyond that, I can't see a lot of optimism, as we've heard already. But thank you.